You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev. Radio MMT. Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another edition of Radio MMT. How are you, Anne?
Hello, Kevin. I'm all right. The question is, how are you? Good to see you back in the saddle.
Yeah, well, I wasn't here at the last one because of a slight bout of COVID. I think it should be called fucking COVID. I'm pretty well vaccinated. I got my first and my second bout really early, within a month of each other, and they lasted for exactly 5 days. And then this one, which is a number of years later, I got again, and it goes for exactly 5 days. So I can confirm, for me, COVID lasts for 5 days.
Good to have you back. And hello to our listener who this episode is Chris.
Chris from Helsinki.
Amazing. Chris from Finland. So we'll get on to Chris's letter later in the hour. But to start with, looming large on the event horizon for modern monetary theory is a film that's coming to Australia, and there are a few opportunities to get connected with this film. Next Wednesday, 6:30 on the 28th of February, film screening will be hosted by the Sustainable Living Festival in Melbourne.
Okay.
So you can go to their website and get tickets.
Now, this film you're talking about, would the film be called Finding the Money? Is this the one you're referring to?
Oh, that is the one.
Yes.
Did I not mention that?
You forgot to mention his name. It's called Finding the Money. It's a movie documentary that follows Professor Stephanie Kelton around discussing MMT with all and sundry, but she's coming out with the movie to attend.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So on Wednesday the 28th of February, the Q&A is with the director, Maren Poitras, who we will be hearing from more later in the hour here. The other opportunity to see this film will be on March the 8th at 7 p.m. at Trades Hall in Carlton. And that screening will be followed by a Q&A with Stephanie Kelton, who is the economist.
And others?
Emma Dawson is emceeing that program.
Emma Dawson, okay.
She's from Per Capita, which
Right.
is a left-leaning think tank in Australia.
Yeah, we kind of like Emma Dawson. We've talked about her before, and sometimes we go, oh, she's getting there, and she probably thinks the same about us, but
And then on the following day after that screening, there is a conversation between Stephanie Kelton and journalist Natasha Mitchell, who is the host of the ABC Big Ideas program. And that once again is hosted by the Sustainable Festival.
Yes, and the reason that we're kind of excited about this movie is because a large part of our mission is to
Spread the word.
Spread the word to get people to understand how the economy works. And it's often described that MMT, modern monetary theory, is the best analytical tool for understanding how the economy works, and is quite confronting to a lot of the orthodoxy. It turns a lot of stuff on its head, which is where the resistance comes from. And if enough people understood how our economy worked, there would be a paradigm shift and things would change. And things would change for the better, because we would understand that we can achieve a lot of the progressive policies that we're told we can't afford.
Yeah, it's like one piece of the puzzle for how you might be able to address climate change, or how you might be able to address the housing crisis, and it's that piece of the puzzle which is about how do you find the money.
Yes, and it certainly arms people against the rhetoric at the moment, which says, we'd like to do this, but we can't afford it. Oh, we'd like to do that, but we can't afford it. And you sort of go, well, actually you can.
Kind of like getting your COVID injection, Kevin. You get inoculated against these false ideas.
Against the nonsense that's thrown at us.
And I'm really looking forward to the film because we haven't seen it. And I'm really interested to see the mainstream economists that she interviewed and she put to them the MMT position. And they apparently had their answers, but...
Hey, now look, if there's any listeners out there that knows anybody of significance, like politicians, drag them along. Just drag them along. If you need help dragging, call me up and I'll help you drag. I've got ratchet straps and all sorts of stuff. People of significance need to see this.
And if you would like to go voluntarily and you are on a fixed income, we do have a couple of tickets to give away.
Oh, yeah.
So you can contact us at radiommt@gmail.com.
Yep.
So we can listen to a little taster of the movie itself.
Right.
And then we'll head to a conversation that you and I had with the director of the film, Maren Poitras. We played the first half of that conversation in our last episode, and this is the second half of our conversation. And one thing that really interested me about Maren talking about making this film was she reminded me of just how important stories are.
Yeah.
And she's a storyteller. And, you only have to look at how much damage we're doing to ourselves because we're telling ourselves the wrong story about money. And so we end up believing that money is a scarce resource. Really, I mean, it's clean air and clean water.
That's
that are scarce resources.
Money is a human invention. We created the monster. We can turn it into whatever we like,
And I kind of think these false stories, I'm not sure that they're entirely accidental. I mean, for sure they're filtered through the power structures in our economy. And so what gets told about money does seem to suit vested interests.
Indeed. Funny about that. Yes.
Shall we have a listen to the teaser for the film?
Let's go.
So much of the public discourse, it's like we're going through life with one eye shut and one eye open, and we're only getting half the picture. And then somebody like me comes in and says, well, let's make sure we see the full picture.
New worries today over the exploding federal debt.
The federal government is
We're
broke.
bankrupting our country.
We want to lift this crushing burden of debt off our children and grandchildren.
The government debt is not a burden on anyone.
The national debt is exactly the opposite of what the orthodox story tells us.
An unconventional economic theory is gaining some traction, modern monetary theory, MMT.
And one of its leading proponents is Professor Stephanie Kelton.
One of the most influential and indeed controversial economists in America today.
In conventional wisdom, surpluses are good, deficits are bad.
We're borrowing trillions of dollars from China.
Does the government have to borrow dollars? No, of course not.
The federal government is where the money comes from.
When a fringe economic theory goes mainstream, you better pay attention.
You could take the national debt clock that scares everyone and just rename it the US dollar savings clock. And I think everybody would have a very different kind of reaction.
The true story of money is not the story that I've been told.
I do live in my MMT bubble, so I forget that most people don't think that we have to worry about the national debt.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just yet to see, what will happen. I think we're all open to, whether this might break into the mainstream conversation that we're having this year in an election year in the US. And
good timing.
Yeah, so, it's all about timing with a little bit of luck. We're a little bit past our debt ceiling scare that has been in the news for quite a bit in the US. As you know, we're kind of the only country in the world with their debt ceiling limit that we self-impose.
Yes.
And so we get that in the news, and that could be a good hook for us to say, hey, maybe we're actually thinking about the debt the wrong way around. But we are still having, every week right now, we're having the risks of the government shutting down, the federal government shutting down over budget wrangling in our Congress. And that comes down to spending and taxing and all the things we're going to be talking about in an election year. Around what our priorities are. Can we afford to tackle climate change? Can we afford to deal with inequality? But we maybe need a different lens instead of the first question always being, oh, well, how are you going to pay for it? Mm-hmm. Or, where are you going to find the money? That's usually the question. And slowly, I think that's starting to shift, but it certainly has not entered the mainstream enough to understand the ramifications of how MMT defines what the national debt is, what the implications are, and then what the real limits are.
It sounds like you've come into MMT with your own personal journey, and you've had to do your research and your homework before you've been able to launch into this project. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. My goal is as a person, on the planet, I guess I care more about, the climate and seeing our societies become more sustainable for humans and for every other species on the planet. And that's my main imperative. And so if that means having to understand how the financial system and monetary system works and how to make films, then that's part of it. But I think I am an activist first. And so don't want to be confused about how all of this works. So yeah, I had to do a lot of reading, but it was frustrating kind of reading the back and forth debates even, because it's like, why don't these people just get on the phone and talk to each other? It's like, yeah, they'll just like write articles back and forth against each other, and they're clearly talking past each other.
Yeah, modern monetary theory, I feel like, is the paradigmatic example of going upstream when you're looking at the polycrisis, housing, health, climate, you name it.
I'm really interested in this subject. I had started from climate and from ecological economics, and then I finally found MMT. So trying to understand these big picture issues, what's causing climate change, and then how can we address such a systemic issue at its roots, with systemic solutions. What do we need to do at the scale and the speed necessary to really address the climate crisis? And that's what brought me to the story of MMT and to money and economics itself. And, when I discovered this kind of underdog group of economists that were seemingly up against quite an uphill battle, where there was a lot of conflict there. There's a lot of controversy where the established mainstream school of economics is saying, no, don't listen to this group of people. They're clearly crazy. They're clearly wrong. And yet there was something in there that just kind of hooked me, right? And something they were saying that made me want to dig further and try to figure out if they were right or wrong. I was pretty skeptical in the beginning. I was like, I want to make sure I kind of, understand what this is, or figure out myself if I think it's crazy or not. And, I think we have this ingrained idea of what money is, or that it's something valuable, something you can hold on to, something like gold. And yet, when you dig a little further, it has a very different nature that we seemingly never talk about, and is even glossed over by economists, the field that you would think is responsible for understanding money. And so that was really what hooked me, is the conflict. At the core of every good story is a good conflict. And so you have this kind of underdog David and Goliath story in the film. There's kind of this story arc of MMT as a group. They've gone from being ignored to being ridiculed and laughed at to being fought. And now the question is, are they going to win? And I think that is still an open question.
Well, Kevin, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win.
Yes.
Well, that's the aim anyway.
So long as they're, if they're ignoring you, it's a bit discouraging sometimes, isn't it?
Sometimes we're still at the ignoring phase. So Maren was mentioning there this thing called the debt ceiling, which the United States has. And I just love it because it's one of those wonderfully ridiculous policies that only a neoliberal could love.
Yeah. This debt ceiling, this goes to the nub of the conflict, the disagreement between orthodoxy and progressive economists.
Right. So these orthodox, neoclassical, neoliberal economists, what they want in a debt ceiling, well, what it is actually is it's what they call a legislative mechanism. And what it does is it restricts the total amount that a federal government can spend. And it does that by limiting the size of the debt. And this is what causes so much trouble in the US, where they reach that limit. And in fact, several countries do have debt limitations, but only Denmark and the United States have a debt ceiling that is set at an absolute amount rather than a percentage of the GDP. And what's so ridiculous about this is if you're the currency issuer, you can't run out of the currency, so you don't need to put a limit on how much you're spending. And if you're the currency issuer and your country has unmet needs along with unused resources that could meet those needs, for example, say your communities are falling apart and you've got lots of unemployed people, you could just use your currency to employ those people and get things done. And of course, you don't need a debt ceiling because you don't have to worry about paying back the debt if you are the currency issuer. So I was looking up debt ceilings, and in my trusty Wikipedia, Kevin, I couldn't believe this. It was truly enlightening, because this is what I read, that between 2007 and 2013, Australia had a debt ceiling.
2007 to 2013, that's the Labor years.
Yeah. So it was the Rudd government who introduced the debt ceiling, and they set it at $75 billion with a B dollars. And the wonderful thing about debt ceilings, and this is what America is finding at the moment, is that the federal government does not really control the total amount of spending that they're going to have to do. And that's because anything that happens in the year, for example, say back in January 2020, the government had no idea that it was about to spend $60 billion on the COVID lockdowns.
Yeah, I mean, like to say that a government has a limit on what it can spend. We describe currency as a score in the economy. It's like they're saying, oh, well, we're not going to give any more scores now. You know, like
it's like stopping the ball game in the middle of the game.
just going, oh, look, we've run out of numbers. You haven't run out of numbers. And the other thing, like you say, is how can you predict what's going to be needed?
You can't.
Occasionally a war pops up, and all of a sudden a government will spend as much as it needs to.
So a budget's always a rough guesstimate, but what they actually spend, they never know. So, of course, in 2009, they had to increase the debt ceiling to $200 billion from that $75 billion.
And that was the GFC.
2011, it's up to $250 billion. 2012, it's up to $300 billion. And then finally in 2013, Joe Hockey realised they were about to reach their debt limit. So
hang on, so you're talking about Joe Hockey now, because you're saying we
2013.
2013 was when the new coalition government under Tony Abbott just got in. Yep.
And so with the support of the Australian Greens, the Abbott government repealed the debt ceiling over the opposition of the Australian Labor Party.
Yeah, and I believe there's a similar thing happening in the US, where some of the strongest supporters of the debt ceiling and making it even harder, the Democrats.
Yeah.
It's like I'll use the term loosely, left-wing parties try to build confidence by putting these limits on their spending. They are playing straight into the neoliberal handbook.
Yes. Well, I think the mistake they're making is they're trying to be good economic managers, but the problem is they're managing the economy like it's a household.
Yeah.
When really they should be managing the economy as though they are the currency issuer.
Now, this thing about a debt ceiling, this goes to the heart of the main difference between progressive economists and neoclassical economists, and which Stephanie Kelton describes in her book, The Deficit Myth, is what is a deficit. And neoclassical orthodox economists regard a deficit as a debt that the government needs to recoup and pay back, and the understanding is that that's done through taxation. What progressive economists understand, and we can give you the evidence for this, is that a government deficit is a private sector surplus. And in particular, government deficits fund profits in the private sector.
So another way to think of government deficits is that it's the government's investment into the economy.
Yeah, it's the government's deficit is the private sector saving.
Yes.
And so if these neoclassical economists do their sums and figure out how to pay back the so-called debt, well, that's easily done. Just grab all the profit from the private sector and give it back to the government. It's essentially like Australia has a national debt, which is the total of all the deficits run year after year, of around $1 trillion. And that means there's around $1 trillion of profit in the private sector.
Right.
And if you want to balance your books the way that the neoclassical economists want to do it, they balance their books by saying that all the money that goes out of the government sector has to come back into the government sector. And when that's done, the books are balanced. Well, of course, if that money is used for profits, then you have to pull all the profits and all the savings out of the private sector, return it to the government, and your books are balanced, but your economy's just gone belly up.
Imagine where we would be if we still had that $75 billion debt ceiling. What that would mean is we would have stopped paying out on NDIS, we would have stopped paying for aged care, we would have stopped unemployment benefits, we would have stopped paying for education and healthcare.
I was watching that ABC doco on the coalition prime ministers. Nemesis. And Howard gave advice to Morrison that when you're faced with a crisis like COVID, ideology goes out the door, right? And what that reveals is ideology goes out the door and the true machinations of your economy kick in.
That's quite a revealing comment.
And so what that says is that their mismanagement of the economy is driven by an irrational ideology. It's a complete misunderstanding of how the economy works. If they believe that the deficit needs to be repaid, this is what they refer to as the debt and deficit disaster for our grandchildren, etc. They believe that the books can only be balanced by returning all of that government money in the private sector back to the government, then we're all screwed. But the proper way to balance the books is to understand where the money's gone. If the money's gone from the government sector into the private sector,
that's right.
So if you want an accounting way of zeroing it out, you don't return it all. You just realise that it's gone from here to there.
That's why Stephanie says it's like they're looking at half the picture. They're only looking at one side of the balance sheet, which is the spending side, but they're not looking at who's receiving the money.
So much of the public discourse, it's like we're going through life with one eye shut and one eye open, and we're only getting half the picture. And then somebody like me comes in and says, well, let's make sure we see the full picture.
So really, all these pollies, they need to go off and see this film, Kevin. They don't have to take our word for it. Go see the film.
It's not even complicated. It's not even complicated.
No.
All they talk about is the government deficit, and they never mention the private sector
savings
surplus.
Okay. The other thing that Maren made a really good point about MMT was that it does take you to the root of the problem. It does clarify things, and it's like this idea of going upstream. So, for example, you might ask yourself, well, why are we having this horrendous challenge of the global warming? And of course, most commentators that you and I would listen to, they would say, well, it's the economy, stupid. It's the way we're doing an economy which is predicated on extraction and endless growth. So then the question is, well, how do you change your economy? And you probably want to change it so that you're actually taking some notice of our biological capacities. And the only entity in the country that can mobilise resources at the speed and at the scale necessary to deal with these huge challenges, and that, of course, is the federal government.
Just like they did during COVID. There was an emergency and they responded overnight. Doubled job seeker, which automatically eradicated a lot of the poverty in the country.
Yes, exactly. So the federal government has two capacities. It has the capacity to make laws, in other words, the rules saying what we can and can't do.
Yep.
And it has the capacity to create dollars. So, for example, if you wanted every home in Australia to have passive solar so that you're lowering your total energy use, you'll use your capacity to make laws to say what are the standards to which we should be building housing, particularly all the public housing that we need.
Yep.
And then you will use your capacity to issue dollars
to make it happen.
To make it happen.
Yeah.
And so what MMT is revealing is this second capacity that the government has, and the necessary capacity. So it's one important part of the puzzle to understand how we're going to deal with all these crises.
And it's not like they don't know how to do it, because they do it all the time. They did it during World War II, they did it during the GFC, they did it during COVID. They do it with defence spending. They do it all the time. This is normal government procedure on how they create money and inject it into the economy. It's just they don't want to admit what they're doing.
I think we need a break.
I think we need to ponder on this for a bit. There was an album that came out yesterday by a favourite band of mine called Phil and the Tiles, an album called Double Happiness. I think it's a very good album. They've got a release for this coming out at the Tote on the 15th of March, I think it is. But here's a little taster, Phil and the Tiles with a song called L.U.X.
watching me. Boil hearts of attention. Boil hearts of attention. I'm gonna get section. I'm gonna get section. And then I feel sane. And then I act right. And then I feel safe. Nobody's inside. And then I feel sane. And then I act right. And then I feel so good tonight. Oh yeah. I'm in my low shoes on the ground. 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 I'm taking money and make me pay. The paranoia and ecstasy. As false screens and reflections. I'm scared of people are watching me. Boil hearts of attention. Boil hearts of attention. Oh yeah. I'm gonna get session. Yes. I'm gonna get session. Oh no. And then I feel sane. And then I act right. And then I feel safe. Nobody's inside. And then I feel sane. And then I act right. And then I feel so good tonight. Oh yeah.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
And Kev.
at 3CR Community Radio, Melbourne, Australia.
Join the National Sustainability Festival in 2024 for a huge program of events this February and March. Featuring visiting economist Stephanie Kelton in conversation about her best-selling book, The Deficit Myth, Uncovering Modern Monetary Theory and the Critical Role of Deficit Spending. Serving as Chief Economist on the US Senate Budget Committee and as Senior Economic Advisor to Bernie Sanders, Stephanie is flipping our understanding of the national debt and the nature of money upside down. For the full festival program and to book online, go to sustainabilityfestival.au. The National Sustainability Festival is a 3CR supporter.
You're on Radio MMT with Anne and Kev. Before those very important announcements, we heard from Phil and the Tiles with their song called L.U.X, which is Luxury Underground Home.
That energised me.
They're good band.
Great band.
Yep.
So we are spending the hour listening to the second half of our conversation with Maren Poitras, who is the director of the film Finding the Money, that we're all very excited about going to see next week and on March the 8th. We could just jump straight back into our conversation with Maren.
Sure, let's pick up where we left off.
I did hear you say in an interview that you were motivated to make this documentary in order to answer the question, why isn't MMT common knowledge? That's a question I've asked myself quite often. But I would like to hear, why do you think MMT should be common knowledge? And did you ever come to an answer to that question as you were making the film?
Yeah, I think it's still just a central question that I had making the film, was trying to understand, could it really be that there's this explanation of how the monetary system works that is just somehow completely overlooked by the mainstream of the field and the textbooks? Like, how can the textbooks just jump over what is money? Where does money come from? Like, those two very simple questions are not, I went searching in quite a few textbooks, from Paul Krugman to Olivier Blanchard to Gregory Mankiw. I checked all those textbooks and I was like, okay, where do they talk about money? And it's maybe a paragraph that says, oh, of course, yeah, before there was money, there was a barter economy, and yeah, obviously that was difficult because you can't trade what you want for exactly what someone else wants at the same time. So they just invented money to make it easier to trade and barter. And it's like, whoa. If you ask anyone besides an economist, if you ask an anthropologist, historian, sociologist, are there any examples of historically barter markets that then evolved into monetary systems, barter systems that invented money? No, like, there's no example of this ever happening in history.
Mm-hmm.
But the economists somehow tell this as if it were just common knowledge. And it is. Today, it's incredibly ingrained in people. Like, even if they're not aware of it or conscious of it, it's deep down in the storytelling. The storytelling of our culture And that's what I think the film is also trying to do, is just change that basic fundamental story we tell about money.
Hopefully, your documentary will assist with this changing of the narrative quite effectively.
Yeah. It's the story, that we tell about money that all of this comes down to, I think. I tried to go interview as many mainstream economists as I could to ask them, where does MMT go wrong? Where in their description of how the monetary system currently operates, where are they incorrect and why? And I just I never found a good critique. I never found a valid critique. The only critiques I came across were just, MMT is crazy. They say you can print infinite amounts of money and it'll never cause inflation and it'll never cause any bad consequences. And it's like, well, that's not what they say. So, let's have a conversation about what they say so we can find out if it's correct or not. I just want to know what's correct. Why is it this grand mystery? And it almost feels like economists want it to be a grand mystery, almost like they're the priests of this mysterious religion. And it's like, don't ask too many questions, or like, don't upset the god of the economy. We don't really know how it works. So just don't upset it and don't ask to change it, because this is the best you can get. There's no alternative. I just feel like there's so much in the mainstream ideology or the neoliberal ideology that when it comes down to it, the core of the conflict that I could find when interviewing the mainstream economists was they would admit, yes, the government creates money. But then on the other hand, they would say, no, the government has to find the money through taxing or borrowing before it can spend, and it could go bankrupt or clearly it's borrowing too much. And they would have all these different conceptions in their mind at the same time that were contradictory. And so, I think what it really came down to was just really not wanting to admit in a way where money comes from, or they never wanted to think about it too much. I had one economist tell me, it's like, just don't think too hard about that. You'll lose the thread. Like, just don't go there. And Stephanie was told that too. She tells this story, her professors, just don't ask the money question. Like, just don't, we just don't do that in economics, because you'll either be ostracized or you'll go crazy.
Wow. That's an insight.
But the core of the conflict comes down to, what is the nature of money? Does it come from the federal government, or does it come from private markets? Is it created by the private market? And so that basic question, I think mainstream economists don't want to go there too much, because they really want to cite the private free market as the fundamental force of the economy, and government as just an intrusion upon that natural system that would work maybe better even without government intrusion, right? So they're always trying to minimize the role of government. And that's why I think the MMT story itself is so fundamental and so interesting, in that it shifts and replaces government and politics itself as this fundamental force. We simply don't have private free markets or monetary systems without first a strong government that can impose taxes and then create a monetary system. And then you can have markets.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
I think this is one of the most accessible pieces of media to come out about MMT, and I hope lots of people take the opportunity to go and have a look at the screening in a room full of other people.
Yeah.
So tell us how people can hear more about the film.
Yeah, I just would love to share, our website is findingmoneyfilm.com. And so you can go there, sign up for our email list, and then you'll be in the know about any upcoming screenings in your area. We might be adding screenings, we might be adding events. You could reach out to us about hosting a screening at your campus or a community screening. We want to do more of those. And then, it's great to keep in touch. Again, like I said, there's more resources on there. We're still looking for maybe just, international distribution or distribution in Australia, but this is a huge step. But I just want to say, Australia you guys are really at the forefront. I'm incredibly impressed by the organizers there and the volunteer efforts. I just can't say enough, how appreciative I am for the people who are stepping up and volunteering so much of their time to help make this happen. So I can't wait to see what happens when we're there in person.
Yeah. So it's been absolutely wonderful to have this chance to speak with you, and we wish you all the best on the film tour through Australia and of course through other parts of the world.
We're looking forward to seeing you in person when the film comes to Melbourne and around the country. So really looking forward to seeing you there, Maren.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Myra made a point there that this doesn't have to be our only possible option to see the movie. If anyone knows a group that would like to host it, I'm sure she would be open to that.
Which is essentially what Modern Money Lab and Stephen Hale and Gabby have done, is just find a venue and try and drum up. It's a hard thing to do, drum up interest for anything. I've been involved with music festivals, and it's hard enough selling tickets to something like that. It's a difficult thing. If you have any interest, you'll have an interesting night. Whether you go on the is it the 28th?
The 28th of February.
February, the
State Library.
The State Library, or March the 8th at the Trades Hall. Yeah.
Maren mentioned the barter myth in all of that, and I just wanted to say we did a whole episode on the barter myth in our episode 21, and that's an example of how a story can just set you on the wrong path when it comes to economics with dire consequences. It's one of the reasons we think we should have a rate of unemployment and keep people in poverty.
The thing I like about barter is people say that the monetary system came from barter. It would seem logical, and there's evidence to support that it's actually the other way around, that you can only barter if you know what something is worth. and you can only know what something is worth if there's a monetary system in place in the first time. So if you're going to start swapping things, without money, you have to know what their value is. And the way you know what their value is if there's a dollar value to it.
Yes. If you believe in the barter myth, you're basically reverse engineering history.
Yeah.
The other thing that Mara mentioned that really stunned me, and it really gave me this sense that, the mainstream economists, they're standing there in front of their students and they're saying, do not look at the monetary system or you will be ostracized or you will be driven insane.
Do you know what they're really saying is do not look at the monetary system or how money originated, because we haven't got an answer and it's just going to be too bloody hard for us. So just avoid that one.
It's like the curse, isn't it? I can just imagine this locked door with this curse on it. You'll be driven mad or you'll be killed. It's just a source of endless fascination to me, the resistance by the mainstream economists to some what you and I think are some very simple logical ideas. For example, when the government spends, it's putting money into the economy, and when it taxes, it's pulling money out of the economy. And of course, we're talking about federal government, not state or local governments. And Maren went through a few reasons about why the mainstream economists are so impervious to all this stuff. So, of course, you can be ostracized and you can ruin your career. Then that idea that you'll be driven crazy by this knowledge, that's the first time I've actually had a sense of how the mainstream economists actively avoid the pain of cognitive dissonance, which they would have to face if they were to look at how money really works.
Yeah, seriously, it's the same as flat earthers, isn't it? It's like getting a flat earther to try and understand that the world is round.
Something like that.
It's just too hard for their brain.
And then Maren made the point that MMT is threatening the supremacy of the private market. So, Kevin, I think you and I were pretty comfortable with the notion that markets are dependent upon the state to exist. And then, of course, the state exists within a society and the society exists within nature and the planet. I don't have a problem with that. But mainstream economists, they react like it's some horrible, dangerous heresy.
Yeah.
So then there is this question that they don't want to look at, which is, where does money come from? Money does come from two places. Does money come from the government? Yes, it does. Does money come from the market? Yes, it does. Mostly through banks. But the thing is, the devil's in the details on this, because the money that the government issues, which it creates when it spends, that's the currency. And it never has to be paid back. And the economists will call that vertical money. And the money that comes out of the private sector, that usually comes out of when banks are lending, and that's what the economists will call horizontal money. And that money is not the currency, it's actually bank credit. So it's like a contract, but the contract is written in the currency, so it looks like dollars to you and me. So both kinds of money look like dollars.
Money enters the economy in one of two ways. It's spent into the economy by the government, or it's lent into the economy by the banks. It's spent into the economy, or it's lent into the economy.
And the difference is that the bank money has to be paid back.
Yes. So if something is lent, it needs to be paid back, and if something is spent, it doesn't.
It doesn't. It can just sit there in the economy forever.
Yep.
And unfortunately, we call it the government debt. But the point is that we have a monetary system, and it is slightly complex, this interaction between the different kinds of money. But I don't think it's going to drive you insane to look at it.
No, well, it can. And here goes my story.
Okay, here's Kevin's story.
So the other day I was doing a job, work as a handyman, so I was recorking a bathroom, and I thought I'd go for lunch, and I walked into a little cafe in Richmond, and as I'm sitting there, I noticed that there was a guy with a laptop and a couple of books, and one of the books he had was Graeber's 5,000 Years of Debt. Okay. And so I've wandered over and I've gone, oh, you're reading Graeber. So this is a book about the origins of money.
And it basically dispels the barter myth.
Yeah, and it does say in there that there was such a thing as privately created money. But if there is private money created, eventually it gets taken over and regulated by governments. Otherwise, it spins out of control. So I said, what do you think of Graeber? And he goes, oh, it's rubbish. And I go, okay, rightio. So I spoke to him. Now, as it turns out, he worked for Treasury. He worked for Treasury in Australia for the federal government. Then he went to London and he was working for a lending institution over there, which went bust during the GFC. And he said that he spent 13 years researching, and he has a book with 3,000 pages in it coming out. And his whole thing was that money needs to come from the private sector, that the government needs to step away from money creation, that the banks need to break their association with the government, and that money needs to be a private thing. The gold standard needs to come back, etc. We had a conversation, and when I asked him some questions, he basically said, oh, look, it's just very complicated. And what occurred to me is that when you don't have an answer, it is very complicated. When you're barking up the wrong tree, when what you're saying doesn't make sense, it's very complicated. And I came to the conclusion that the poor fellow has just wasted 13 years of his life and is going to produce a book, a 3,000-page book of nonsense. Poor fella.
Oh,
he seemed like a nice fella. And look, we had a conversation would have gone for 45 minutes to an hour. I took a long lunch just because I thought, look, you don't get an opportunity like this.
Yes. And just think that was someone who was pretty up close to the whole mechanisms of money creation.
I was able to speak fluently to him about everything. He tried to bamboozle me with stuff, and I was able to bat it straight back to him. I was able to give him simple scenarios, but he could not give me simple explanations for anything.
Handyman with a bit of MMT can talk to an ex-Treasury official.
Yeah, and make more sense. Now, we need to digest that with a song, and we're going to go back to Fill in the Tiles with a song called Real Estate Mastermind.
This is the time for me. I just got to make a change and make something a bit different. It'll be good for me, they say, but I don't know about that.
So Fill in the Tiles with the Real Estate Mastermind. They're doing an album launch at the Tote on March the 15th. Go and check them out. They're a good band.
I love that song. They're speaking to a generation who's dealing with a housing crisis.
Hey, Chris from Helsinki.
Who is self-studying MMT because, in his words, he feels it's very important that everyone should know how our monetary system works. Now, he was asking us a question.
Yeah.
Kevin, I'm going to throw this one to you.
We're talking about foreign exchange stuff here, but ask the question.
He said, when Russia had just invaded Ukraine, Putin said that he wanted the gas Russia was selling to be paid in rubles rather than in euros, and the EU refused to do that. And so his question is, what would have happened if they were selling in euros? What would have happened if they were selling gas in rubles? And would this have had the effect of bringing up the value of the ruble?
Rightio. So a disclaimer. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Clue.
I don't know what I'm talking about, but this is my logic behind this. And if any feedback, please email us. So Putin is saying that he wants to be paid in rubles, and it sounds like he's trying to raise rubles. But
Russia issues the rubles, so why would they be demanding payment in rubles?
Okay, so the answer is he's not trying to increase the supply of rubles. He's trying to increase the demand for rubles. So what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine was lots of sanctions were put on Russia, and they're trying to strangle the Russian economy and say that the ruble, you can't buy anything with rubles, you guys, you're screwed because we're just going to shut everything down.
That's how they put trade sanctions on, isn't it? They cut them out of the currency trading system.
So then if you can't use rubles, then the value of rubles drops and drops and drops. And therefore, if you're in Russia and you want to import something and you're using rubles, everything gets more and more expensive because people are going to say, we don't want your rubles. And they say, well, have it over here twice as many, 3 times. And so you end up with your ruble being devalued.
Right.
Because there's no demand for it because it's been hexed, by sanctions, etc. But this is me talking here. This is not. So what you do is you say, rightio, well, we've got something that you want. And if you want it, you're going to have to pay in rubles. And then the people who want to buy the gas, the foreign entities that want to buy the gas, say, well, now we need some rubles.
Now we need the rubles.
So how do they get the rubles? Well, they have to open up trade with Russia.
They have to sell something to Russia.
And so it's a give and take situation.
So they get around the trade sanctions.
Yeah, now that's just me logicking it out. And there's all sorts of foreign exchange mechanisms, and sometimes central banks get involved. I started reading about this last night.
You went down a rabbit hole, did you?
And then my brain glazed over, and I went, oh no, I can't. I need to do a lot more reading.
It's a whole show, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's complicated because once you start moving your currency into different regimes and you have all these entities buying and selling it and trying to alter the value of it, it gets really bloody complicated. I was reading yesterday in macroeconomics. It said it gets really bloody complicated.
Yeah, so we do love getting the curly questions from our listeners.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris, for
reaching out to us all the way from Finland, which is rather close to Russia, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah. And incidentally, if you have any input on that, because I'm sure I've said something which is incorrect, and let me know. We're all on the journey learning here together. We're learning.
Not economists.
We appreciate your input and we appreciate your questions. So thank you very much, Chris from Helsinki. And we did liaise with him on email a bit, but we try our hardest.
Well, that's us done. The next Friday we're usually here is International Women's Day. But we will be back after all the screenings of Finding the Money and hope to see you there, and we'll probably have a chat about how that all went.
And International Women's Day occurs on the same day as the Trades Hall screening of Finding the Money, which is being presented by Stephanie Kelton.
It's an all-women panel.
All-women panel there, so it's all good, so come along. Anyway, we'll see you in the next show, whenever it might be.
See you then, Kevin.
Bye.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to, like, form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get musical.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.